All right, hey, good morning, everybody. We're down in Carson, and it's anyhow.
Oh, crap.
That's gonna be. Should we start?
It's got to stop. Hey! Hey! Sorry.
Okay. Anyhow, we're back in business, and as I said, we're down in Carson at Carroll Shelby's factory, where all kinds of wild and wonderful things are going on. And anyhow, we want to hear about some of the memories of Carroll Shelby. Carroll, tell me, what started you on this road, and what got you interested in cars?
My father always loved cars, Bill, and when I was 4 or 5 years old, I'd go with my dad on his mail route, and we would, I'd always want him to go faster in a car. And by the time I was 8 or 9 years old, I knew the difference in most of the model cars that were on the road. I could tell you the difference in airplanes. My interest is in cars, airplanes, and locomotives.
Good.
And I've never lost interest in any of those things in life. I don't know much about locomotives. I flew airplanes during the war, and I've had and flown airplanes ever since. Not as seriously as I would like to, because my life has been taken up with the automobile business most of the last 50 years. But, God damn it, it's got to stop. I always loved, as I said, the three things: automobile, cars, and locomotives. However, my life has been spent mostly with automobiles, and that's because that's the way I've tried to make my living the last 50 years. I got out of the Army Air Corps in 45 with a wife and daughter, and I felt obligated to go out and try to whip the world and make up for the 5 years I'd been in the Air Force. And I tried several different businesses. I tried the ready-mix concrete business. I tried the chicken business. I tried the trucking business. I roughnecked in the oil fields. I thought about going into the oil business. However, about around 1950, a friend of mine in Dallas that I'd gone to high school with loved sport cars, and he was building his own. So we formed a partnership and got into my garage and started building our own sport car, and that lasted about 3 months, till about 2 o'clock one morning my wife came out and said, "I don't know whether you and Ed are leaving, but there's not going to be any more banging on these fenders out here at 2 o'clock in the morning with 3 kids asleep, trying to sleep."
Love it.
So with that, my chicken business failed. Got what you call the Limberneck Newcastle disease. We can thank Purina for giving me some bad some bad chemicals that you inject them with, and they killed them all. So Purina still owes me a lot of money, which I'll never collect, but it forced me to go into something that I'd always wanted to and thought about a lot, and that was trying to drive race cars. So I took Ed Wilkins' MG, TC. We went to a race in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and I won the MG under 1500 race, and then I raced it against the Jaguars and the other larger displacement cars, and I won that race. So that gave me a little confidence that I could kind of hold my own out there. I'd fiddled around with motorcycles before the war. I'd fiddled around with stock cars a little bit after the war, just in a very, very amateurish way. So, to make a long story short, I decided I'm going to take a shot at it. Well, 3 years later, I was driving for the Aston Martin team in Europe. That was 54. And I did pretty well at that. However, the Astons at the time were fast in England, but they weren't fast outside. They were okay in the long distance races, but not as fast as the Jaguars. Anyway, I had a friend named Alan Giberson in Dallas that Phil Hill drove for, and Phil drove a Ferrari in a Mexican road race with Richie Ginther and finished second. And Phil was going to drive a race at Torrey Pines in Von Neumann's 3.5-liter Ferrari. And Alan asked me if I wanted to drive the old Ferrari that Phil had driven, and I went down there and won the race. And that introduced me to Tony Paravana, and I drove some races for him in '55, and that led to John Edgar, who's very prominent here in Southern California as a car owner, which you knew, Bill. You used to drive with John,
too, yeah. And Tony.
And by the way, I just got some books from Bill to sign. Yeah, It's a wonderful book of all of our years in the 50s. I'm so glad that Bill put that together.
Yeah, I helped him. Well, he called me.
Yeah, I know you did. Yeah, But anyway, that led to I would go to Europe and race as much as I could. However, I had a family with 3 children, and it was very difficult. So I raced, and in 1956, I won the Sport Car Club of America Championship in a 49 Ferrari that had been built for Fangio. And he got in a tiff with old man Ferrari. I guess not a tiff, but they didn't get along very well. And he went back to Maserati, so this car was available, and John Edgar bought it. And I won a lot of races in that car. We took it to Seattle. I won the race against Phil in the 3. He was in the 3.5, and I was in the 4.9. Naturally, on the long straights there, I should have won it. Yeah, you were up there, weren't you?
Yeah, I was in the HWM.
Yeah, HWM. By the way, I never did figure out, Bill, why when you went around the corner in that thing,
if you want to go around a corner.
No. The wheels leaned the same way, and I thought, poor old Bill's going to kill himself in that damn thing when I saw you.
Did. I took a tour off the course, and hit some stumps. It was
a horrible handling car. I felt so sorry for you having to try to muscle that thing around.
It would go really good in a straight line, but just don't try to turn it.
Oh, it was horrible. But anyway, I won a lot of races in that car. We didn't change the spark plugs till the 11th race.
My God.
It was a fabulous car.
It was.
And then in '57, I switched over to Maserati, and they kind of screwed me around because they were getting in a financial bind, and I didn't know about it. But I did. They were going to give me a 4.5-liter and a 3-liter to race wherever we wanted to with John Edgar. Well, we wound up having to purchase the 4.5-liter, and to shorten the story, the 4.5-liter Maserati was a darn good car, and I won a lot of races in it in '57.
It was a hell of a car.
Yeah, '57, and part of '58. And in '57, I started a sport car dealership in Dallas with Jim Hall's brother named Dick, a wonderful man. He was losing his eyesight, and we lost him a few years later, but he was just a wonderful person. And we were the Rolls Royce, MG, Jaguar. We dealt in everything. And I had to start spending some time in Dallas with that. In between going to Europe, and I bought 10 listers to put Chevrolet engines in, and we started that trend. We sold a lot of Maseratis. I think I sold about 6 or 7 4.5-liters, and 2 or 3 3-liters. And I went to Maserati factory, and I got them to build 2.5-liter engines going to 2-liters, and I ordered 5 of those, and we sold all of them. But it was getting to be a lot of work going back and forth to Europe all the time and trying to run the dealership. So about 1959, I decided I had to decide what I wanted to do, and Aston Martin came along with their Formula One car, which was a year too late. but it was a wonderful handling car, a little underpowered, and I drove that in 1959, and I got a real lucky break at Le Mans. Roy Salvador and I were in the Aston Martin, which was about 4 or 5 miles an hour slower down the straight. However, sometime after 12, 14 hours, the Ferrari that was leading the race with Phil and John DeBean sprung a leak in the block casting or head casting or something, and we won the race. But a lot of times it takes luck to win the race, especially in a 24-hour race. And John Wire was a wonderful team manager. He set times for us to run. You knew and you know now at Le Mans, there's never been a car built you can drive as fast as you can go at Le Mans and have the car finish. You always have to take care of the brakes, the gearbox, the engine. But anyway, that was 40 years ago, over 40 years ago, and that was something that really helped me at the time to be recognized, and I took that I took that win and tried to turn it into a business, so to speak. I knew that I wanted to build my own car all along, and I'd built 3 Corvettes that Ed Cole gave me took Corvette chassis and put aluminum bodies on them, and that was going to be my first project. So about the time we finished them, Ed Cole called me in Modena, Italy one night and says, "I never gave you those cars. The chairman of the board just chewed my ass out real good." And I told him that it was your deal, it wasn't ours. So that deal didn't pan out, and I decided to move to California where the hot rodders were to help me build my cars, the cars that I wanted to build. Didn't have much money, got a divorce because my wife didn't want to move out here, and got the Goodyear tire distributorship. Moved into Dean Moon's shop temporarily with that, and about that time Ray Brock from Hot Rod Magazine called me and says, "Hey, Ford's got a new little thin wall cast iron engine, 221 inches. And I'd been fiddling with the Oldsmobile aluminum block engine, and about that time I read that AC Cars had lost their Bristol contract, Bristol engine. Bristol decided to quit building engines, which, by the way, that Bristol engine was a BMW engine.
I know it
not
is,
very few people realize that was a German engine.
It was a 1930 design.
Yeah. So I went to Ford, to Dave Evans. I went to Pikes Peak Hill Climb with my Goodyear tire dealership and covered that. And I met Dave Evans from Ford. I told him what I had in mind. He said, "Why don't you come back to Detroit?" So I went back to Detroit. Oh, in the meantime, I'd gone to AC Cars to see if they were interested in this. And they said, "Yes, we're looking for an engine. We're using the Ford 6-cylinder engine, which doesn't have enough power." So I went to Detroit with Dave Evans, met Don Fry, who took me to Lee Iacocca, and I said, "If you'll give me $25,000, I'll build you a car that'll blow the Corvette off." And Lee and I laugh about that. You know, Iacocca lives about 2 blocks from me here in town now, but we're both approaching 80, and we were both in our mid-30s at that time, so that's how far that relationship goes. And he supposedly said, "Well, you go out in the hall and we'll discuss that here." And he said, "If that guy can beat the Corvette," he said, "he's either mad, he's going to bite somebody, or let's give him a chance." So they gave me $25,000, and I went to AC Cars, and we started stuffing, and they gave me a few engines, and started stuffing an engine in there. We started putting Weber carburetors on the engine, seeing what we could do at Dean Moon's shop, and wound up very quickly. They went to 260, and finally the engine wound up 289, and eventually the 302 version of it.
Wow.
But we put it in there, and you knew immediately that it had some potential. Although it was rough, it wasn't very reliable. We eventually wound up with a car that didn't have one nut and bolt from AC, but it still had the old archaic 1935 suspension of 2 transverse leaf spring, an old chassis that had about 700 pounds flex, which now we're running 15,000 pounds on the chassis. But this thing wiggled so that the wider Goodyear tires we'd put on there, it would bend so that all 4 of them would stay on the ground.
You could see it.
Yeah.
When you watched
the chassis, it was a horrible, horrible chassis. But Ken Miles and Phil Remington changing everything, and Ken Miles doing the development work, made it work. Well, we won the national championship in '63, and we didn't have as much money as people thought. Ford didn't finance all this. Castrol, Goodyear, the accessory companies did. Ford helped us some, but they still weren't convinced that we had anything. And suddenly, when we started winning all these races and beating the Corvettes, they decided that we should build 500. We had originally planned to build 100, and we said, well, they sold, so well, let's build 500 of them. So I went to AC and I drew up a contract to build 500. And in the meantime, we got word that Chevrolet was building Zora Duntop was building the Grand Sport. So Ken and I sat down one day and says, Christ, we got to do something here. And he said, let's put a 427 in a 289 chassis. Oh, Christ.
Sure.
We've got enough trouble getting this 289 in there. I'll be darned if 2 weeks later Ken Miles didn't have one in there.
Really?
Yeah, and we called that old car the Turd. Because it handled so bad. Ken kept working on that thing and kept working on it. And the Grand Sport went to Nassau. We took the 427, and he ran off the road and hit something. But it was so much faster than the Grand Sports, yet the Grand Sports get all the credit how they blew the Cobras off in Nassau. But it's too bad that Ken happened to deviate off the road, because you'd have never heard of the Grand Sport if the old Turd hadn't run off the road and ruined the suspension. But anyway, winning the national championship led to us daydreaming one day that, boy, wonder what we'd do against a GTO Ferrari. And that was when the World Championship was a GT championship outside of Formula One. The Sport Car Championship was a GT championship. So we had Pete Brock was my first employee. He did advertising, he did everything. And he had graduate of Art Center and had worked at GM on the Corvette program a short while. And Ken and I sat down with Pete and said, what if we built a coupe? Or built something that pierced the air a little better than the old 289. You know, it was like a brick flying through the air at 150 miles an hour. It just stopped. You could throw another 100 horsepower in it, and it wouldn't run 10 miles an hour faster. So Pete sat down and sketched this out, and in 3 months we had a Daytona coupe. We took it to Riverside. That was before we didn't have enough money to go to wind tunnels and all that. We did have, my friend Benny Howard had a wind tunnel, and he told us what he thought was right and wrong with it, which helped a lot. And the people at Ford, the missile, their missile company, Arrow, something down in Newport Beach anyway, they helped us tremendously. They had a bunch of PhDs down there that helped us a lot with it. But we took the car out to Riverside, had all these cotton tufts on it, and they all went forward when we went down the straightaway, and the rear end came completely off the ground. Ken said he got up to 170 miles an hour, and suddenly the rear end came off the ground.
Oh boy.
So between Ken and John Collins and Bill Remington and Pete Brock and all the rest of them. It took us about 3 months to get this thing so it was really working. Air dams, cutting holes here. Took it to Daytona, led the race. We spilled some gasoline and they hit the rear brakes, which were quite hot, and we were way ahead of the GTO Ferraris. Probably would have won the race overall. But we were out. Took it to Sebring, won the GT class, and then in '64 we said, about the middle of the season, we said, hey, we can blow these GTOs off so easily, let's go to Europe. So we went over there, raced about 4 races, and were with 1 point of, we were 1 point behind Ferrari after missing half the races. And we were going to Monza. Six Daytona coupes, boy, I mean, they were all cranked up and ready to go. And oh man, Ferrari got the Monza race canceled.
Really?
Well, you know,
I
he's
didn't
God.
know that.
Yeah, he's God. So next year, what the old man did, he put 4-liter engines in the GTOs very quietly and turned them over to the private entries, so that he knew that the Daytona Coupes would probably beat him. But we won the World Championship before the season was half over. And that was that. And about that time, Ford was very interested. I'd gone to Europe with Ray Geddes from Ford and Hal Sperlich, and we bought the Eric Broadley's GT Coupe, Lola Coupe. We knew that we had to be more sophisticated than a Daytona Coupe, and Ford really wanted to win Le Mans. So we bought that coupe and hired John Wire, and that's where the GT40 came from.
I wondered about that.
And we built them in England, and we went in '64, had a lot of teething problems. I think we were competitive, but not competitive as far as endurance was concerned. Then in '65, Ford had tried to buy Ferrari, and Ferrari turned them down. So Ford built us the engines, and we did a lot of aerodynamic work, spoilers and so forth, had them running good, but at the last minute Ford said, we're going to rebuild the engines, and they did, got some soft head bolts, and all 4 of them blew up.
Oh.
I mean, all 8 cars blew up within 4 hours. Henry Ford was there with his son Edsel, and Edsel supposedly turned around to his father and said, is this the best Ford can do? He was about 15, 16 years old. Well, that really pissed Henry off. So in September of '65, Henry Ford called Leo Beebe, who was in charge of Ford Racing, Ray Geddes, Don Fry, and I in, and says, and he had our name tags made up, says, Le Mans '66, Ford first, with our name tags on them. Well, we about shit, because that was 9 months away. And to tell you that we're going to win Le Mans, we knew what a gamble it was. But we walked back down the hall, and Don Fry said he didn't tell us what our fiscal responsibilities were. We walked back in, and Henry said, would you all like to have a job next year? Well, we knew he wasn't going to fire us if we lost, because Leo Beebe had been his commanding officer during the war. He pulled him out when Henry was called back to run Ford, and he was his troubleshooter, and he would send him on the damnedest missions. Like 200,000 Hungarians came over here. We're in New Jersey, and Leo got the job to go get them jobs and places to live and distribute 200,000 of them. And so, being a troubleshooter, he put him in charge of the Le Mans program after the fiasco in '65. So there's probably never been a program, because there'll never be another Henry Ford, that didn't have a budget. We broke the windshields at practice in April, and next morning, the 707 arrived at Orley Field with 6 windshields on it. You just can't imagine the things that went on in that program. There's no telling what it cost. There had never been a program like it. But we won Le Mans in 66 and 67, and that was the highlight, going back to Le Mans and winning it as an entrant. And winning it as a driver was probably the highlight of my career. And that was really about the end of race. When they outlawed the 7-liter engine, I had 8 racing teams going all over the world. And at one time I had to go to Le Mans 3 times in 1 week. And that was too much. I already had heart trouble. You know, I won Le Mans taking nitroglycerin pills as a driver. So at the end of 67, I pretty well lost interest in racing. And we had been building the Mustangs. Icoca wanted us to do that. That was a pretty successful program until the Mustang kept getting bigger and bigger, and we had safety and emissions coming on then. So I decided to hell with it. I'm going to Africa for 10 years, and I went for 12 years.
12 years?
Yeah, I spent 9 months a year in Africa for 12 years.
What were you doing?
I had hunting companies. I went all over Africa. I had me a wonderful vehicle that I just traveled all over Africa with a
I never heard about
Land
that.
Cruiser and with a trailer, and I just went where I wanted to, and I had owned hunting companies over there. I wound up spending 9 years in Central African Republic, old French Equatorial Africa. And then Icoca called me one day when I was over here and says, I was run off from Ford, but now I'm at Chrysler and I need you. And I said, I don't care much about cars anymore. I don't care anything about performance cars, because there is no performance in America because of the emissions and so forth. Little 4-cylinder engines and V8s that put out 120 horsepower, big V8s. So anyway, I went back to Chrysler, and I wound up staying there 12 years, and they were very enjoyable years. My office was next to Tom Gale's for a long time, and I made some wonderful friends back there, and wound up us building the Viper, which Bob Lutz and I just decided to do that one morning. Said we need a sport car, and we were starting into a recession, serious recession. And my job was more or less to get us in deep enough so that Icoca couldn't cancel it. I'd have to sit down with Icoca once a week and tell him everything was wonderful. And by the time we got in at about $20 million, it's too late to back out.
Where did the 10-cylinder engine come from?
10-cylinder engine, that was Bob Lutz's deal. Bob says, let's take the 318 and put 2 cylinders on it. And he did that. And I wanted to put a V8 in a sport car, in a Viper. He wanted to put the V10, and naturally he won, it turns out he was absolutely right. I wanted to put a V8 with supercharger or turbocharger on it. But about that time, my heart started giving out, and I had a place here in California in Whittier that we were building Dodges, all kind of Dodges, pickup trucks and everything, hopping the little 4-cylinder engines up, and we wound up with that 90 horsepower 2.2-liter engine. We were pulling 750 horsepower out of it. Yeah. I've got 2 of those little GLHs that we built now that have over 400 horsepower in them.
How the hell did you get 700 horsepower out of the 2-liter
turbocharger? Yeah, and they had a very strong block. And by the time I built a head, I built a 4-valve head for it.
Okay.
And when I say we got 750 horsepower, we didn't operate it at 750 horsepower. But on the dyno, we had 2 or 3 hours at way over 500 horsepower. And my engine guy that did the work sits right here and builds the 427 aluminum engines we build now. But I had the heart transplant, and I had to get out of the Viper program, which I was a little sick about because John Fernandez, who is in charge of the Viper program now at Chrysler, and I had a 2,800-pound sport car built with the V10 engine. And Chrysler decided to take it back there to build it, and it wound up being a 3,800-pound car, which was pretty disgusting to me. But it was time for me to move on because Icoca was leaving anyway. So with that, I left Chrysler, and the Viper changed the face of the company. It really transformed that company.
It certainly did.
And so I had my heart transplant, and about that time, in '95, my kidneys failed. And after the heart transplant, you take a lot of medication to keep your immune system killed, and it killed my kidneys. And my son gave me a kidney in '96, which was a lot harder to get over than a heart transplant. And about that, as soon as I got up, I wanted to build another sport car. And John Rock, who's a wonderful man at General Motors, ran the Oldsmobile division. I sat down, made a deal to build a sport car, and I got started and got a few $1,000,000 into it. And damned if that guy Zarilla didn't fire John Rock and left me hanging there with women running Oldsmobile and a big mess on my hands. It cost me about $35 million in the things that we had to buy that we hadn't planned on, that Oldsmobile was going to take care of. So we started building Series 1s in Las Vegas, and I ran into financial problems to the extent I didn't want to get myself in so deep that I'd been in pretty bad health. I didn't want to get to a point where I was really hurting myself financially. So I sold out the company, half the company, to outfit called Venture, who had been building our bodies and interiors and so forth. And I have a wonderful partner up there named Larry Winsett, who we've got the Series 1 now, where it blows off any sport car with a supercharger. And here it sits right here behind us. This one, I want you to drive it before you leave, Bill.
Okay.
And we're building 500 of them. We're still building old Cobras. I'm suing all these guys that knock them off. And this Friday, I might get a court-ordered injunction to chop them all up. I offered years ago, I said to you guys, give me $1,000 for my heart foundation, for my children's foundation, which I formed after I got my heart transplant. I was so lucky to get it that I help kids. My foundation helps kids. And those guys all sent me 4-letter words over the internet, on their websites, telling me what I could do to myself, that they weren't going to give me anything. So I'm about $3 million down the road now, but I've got them now in my gun sights, and this Friday we'll see what happens. But I'll beat them anyway. I'll get them if we have to go to trial, but I might get an injunction just stopping them. The judge has warned them 3 times now. So that brings me up to date, Bill.
Well, fantastic. That is
wonderful.
That's a hell of a story.
Yeah. Been my friend 50 years. We don't see each other very often, but we've known each other now 50 years since I first came to California.
Yeah, I remember when you first came out here. I remember meeting your wife.
Yep.
Little blonde girl.
Yep.
And you with your trademark overalls.
Yep. I put those things on one day. I had the chicken farm, and at the National Guard station in Fort Worth, we had a race, and I looked down, and it was an hour and a half till time to race, and I still had chicken shit all over my overalls. And so I jumped in a pickup truck and drove over there and won the race in an Allard, by the way, which I won 7 or 8 races in Texas in Allards. You drove Allards a lot, and I always really liked those things. You know, Bill, those things, we could have won races for years in those things if we really had a gearbox.
That was it.
Yeah. The old Mercury gearbox, you know, the 3-speed.
You have to throw it away after every race.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that reminds me,
You had a Jaguar 4-speed or a modern, any kind of a
Well,
flat
the Jaguar probably would have handled it. I remember one time at Elkhart Lake in 1960, Max Balchowski said, "You want to drive Old Yellow?" And they had a $20,000 purse, and I was going to, whoever won that race got $7,000 and I was getting the Cobra started. I wasn't in very good financial shape after my divorce, moving to California, trying to get things started. So I said, yeah, I got that thing, and I led it up to about 8 or 9 laps from the end. And there were some darn good cars there, 7 or 8 bird cages, the Scarabs and stuff. And I was going up the hill there at the straightaway, and clunk, that Jaguar gearbox broke.
Oh.
And I coasted into the pits, and I said, "Max, the gearbox broke." He said, "You weren't hard on it, were you?" I said, "Hell no, it wouldn't have gone this far, Jaguar gearbox. You got about 400 horsepower in that Buick engine there." I said, "I was easy as I could be." He says, "God damn it, I gave $40 for that gearbox too." That was Max Balchowski for you.
That was Max.
It cost me, I said, it cost me $7,000.
Yeah. Max is out $40.
Yeah.
I love it.
He'd build those old things, those old yellows. He'd get down there on the floor, he and Ina, and just take a piece of chalk and draw the chassis out and sit there and put them together. And they handled as good as anything, but nobody knew what Max's secret was. They never got onto it till years later. He used street tires on it, and they were a hell of a lot softer than the racing tires.
Yeah, well, that was what we had on Tom Carson's hour.
Was it?
Yeah, that's why we ran the white
Oh, that's right. You had white wall.
Because
Yeah.
he had a warehouse full of rubber tires that he'd put aside for the salesman, because Korea was, the Korean thing was on, and all you could get was synthetics.
Yeah. Well, you know, all these little old 100-mile races we had here in California, we would have all been better off with the Ferraris and stuff if we'd run street tires instead of those old hard Firestones and Goodyears.
Yeah.
We'd have been a hell of a lot better off and gone a lot faster.
Wear 'em out.
Yeah. Anyway, a lot of fun. It's been a great life.
It's been a lot of
And
fun.
I want to thank you all for coming down here. And
Thanks again, Carroll.
good.